Бид өнөөдөр Bloomberg-ийн ярилцах цагаар хаан investment-ийн захирал ноён Travis Hamilton-ыг урьж авч ирээд байна. Түүний хөрөнгө оруулалт Монголд хаашаага чиглэж байгааг бид энэ удаад хүндэх болно. Welcome to Talk to Bloomberg.
Thank you very much for having me.
Can I just ask why Mongolia? What's so special about this country?
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer because it would be a very long response. But if I could sum it up, I think Mongolia represents a huge opportunity from a foreign investor's perspective. It was an economy and a country that was originally drawn to my attention back in mid-2006. I think it's an absolutely stunning country. It's blessed with amazing natural beauty, but it also has an absolutely phenomenal resource endowment, which fortunately happens to be right next door to the world's largest and fastest growing commodity consumer. I think also given the country's history, it's a very, very interesting place to come and look at the opportunities. Obviously there's a very large resource endowment, there's very little infrastructure at the moment, it's a relatively small population for a country that has a massive land mass. It's a very, very interesting and unique story.
In the eyes of investors looking at Mongolia, especially after the last election, there are some uncertainties surrounding the Mongolian investment environment. And are you one of those who are concerned about the ways that the business is being done in Mongolia?
I think if we look forward, I don't yet have any concerns, although I have frustrations that it is certainly taking a little bit of time to gain clarity on exactly what the foreign investment law, the process of review is going to be. That's certainly a frustration for us. We are also a little bit frustrated with the time that it is taking for an adoption of the new securities law. However, we see that fortunately, from our perspective, whether it's the Financial Regulatory Committee, the Mongolian Stock Exchange with its partnership with the London Stock Exchange, everything seems to be moving in the right direction. I continually warn or advise our international investors that you have to have patience. But we've now seen a number of months of stagnation pre-election. The election was 2 months ago now, just over 2 months ago, and we're certainly hoping that we can get some clarity in the near term.
Well, I mean, before it was just one single event, the election was, where Mongolia had general election as well as the local election, both taken a short period of time, but now it's split evenly. Whereas you have to wait for the local election to complete. So don't you think the election season is not yet over?
Well, that's correct. I mean, the election season isn't over, and we're going to be waiting patiently to see the outcome there. However, I think following the general elections now, there is an opportunity for the new administration and the coalition to hopefully come out and make some definitive comments and policy stance.
What will make you happy, for example?
Clarity. Clarity.
Which you don't have now.
Which we don't have now. If the answer is A or the answer is B, we'll work with A or we'll work with B. But we'd like to know exactly what the outcome is going to be.
One of the things that was worrying was recent decision from Chalco to withdraw its bid offer to take over South Gobi Sands. And how do you interpret that move? Is it because of the clarity being one of the substances that's lacking in Mongolia?
I think that definitely has something to do with it. Honestly, we're not surprised that the withdrawal has been made. The bid was originally put at 68 Hong Kong dollars. Today the stock is trading at about 18 Hong Kong dollars. We're not surprised by that. I think that there's some frustrations, obviously, from Chalco, from China as well. I think that a lot of frustration has arisen from the foreign investment law that was rushed through pre-election. From our perspective, I think everybody understands that you need to protect your sovereignty, whether it's economic security, particularly, which I think was the issue here. However, from our perspective, we see that the issue is more with regards to a transfer pricing concern as opposed to actually an ownership concern. When the government is issuing licenses for either exploration or for mining, these are mining leases. It's not an ownership of title. And there is obviously a concern that if you own across the entire value chain from mine to logistics to actually the smelters, etc. in China, that you'll have a potential issue where there's transfer at cost. And therefore, obviously, Mongolian government would miss out on much needed tax dollars. But I think in other jurisdictions, there's already mechanisms and regimes in place in order to protect transfer pricing issues. And really, I think that hopefully that's something that the new administration will recognize, and perhaps they might try and engineer something from a transfer pricing perspective as opposed to limiting ownership in huge projects that require massive amounts of capital expenditure.
When you talk about an access to Mongolian investment opportunities, you have to, I think, encourage and convince a lot of other investors too. And what has been the change of their attitude to Mongolia recently, because of obviously because of the recent developments?
Look, to be perfectly honest, it's a very challenging time to raise capital, not just for Mongolia, but I think for anything that is deemed to be risk assets. International or global investor sentiment, I think, is really at an all-time low. There's a huge amount of concerns with regards to European sovereign default, a potential breakup of the European Union. There's stagnation in the US at the moment as we're approaching an election there. There had been concerns of a US recession. Everybody is concerned at the moment about the current perceived slowdown in China. All of these issues individually have made investors globally very, very nervous about investing in equity markets, and beyond that, particularly within the resource sector. Put on top of that some of the local issues associated with investment into Mongolia, the elections, the often misunderstood arrest of the former president here, the foreign investment law, a number of other complications, has essentially made a lot of investors very, very wary about placing capital here. From our perspective, we see huge opportunities in Mongolia. I'm not concerned at all about default in Europe or recession in the US or slowdown in China. I don't think that even if all of those issues were to come to fruition, that will have a very negligible impact on Mongolian GDP growth. The fact is that we hear about these phenomenal growth figures, and people are often bamboozled by very large double-digit GDP growth numbers. But in reality, what people need to take into consideration is we're coming off a very, very low base here. In 2011, GDP was $8.6 billion. I mean, that can be equated now to the value of Tavan Tolgoi when it's likely to go to market next year. Rio Tinto and Ivanhoe Mines on our Turquoise Hill has already invested a level beyond that into the current Oil Tolgoi project. So in my mind, China is still growing. I mean, even if we see a reduced growth rate of 7%, I mean, in absolute terms, it's huge. 7% growth in 2012 in absolute numbers is actually larger than 12% growth in 2007. And in my mind, at the moment, the only impediment that's preventing China from acquiring more of its resource inputs from Mongolia is simply the lack of infrastructure in place at the moment in order to access those resources. And I think as we see infrastructure come online, and we've seen some fantastic developments from the private sector already in the last couple of weeks that I've been visiting. Mongolian Mining Corporation, for example, recently raised $600 million in March to fund their own railway. That will be operational in Q1 of 2014. Once we see projects like this online, I think Mongolian resource exports are going to increase at quite outstanding multiples.
And speaking of Han investment, what are the portfolios? I assume it's pretty, well, I mean, including mining, is it?
It is. I would like to point out, quite categorically that the Khan Mongolia Equity Fund is not a resource-focused fund. When we conceived the fund in early 2011, we wanted to put together an investment vehicle, the objective of which was to provide access to the opportunities afforded for growth by the rapidly expanding Mongolian economy. So we don't have any restrictions with regards to sector or industries. However, the structure that we put in place offers monthly dealing or monthly liquidity for our investors. So from that perspective, every investment that we make, we have to keep liquidity management first and foremost in our mind. So that limits us very much to investing in predominantly listed equities. We're not a private equity fund, so we're investing in any company that has significant assets assets or operations in Mongolia. And we invest in the Mongolian stock exchange, stocks that are listed here locally. But from my perspective, the Mongolian growth story was a lot more than simply about investing locally. We've identified at the moment 74 companies across international exchanges, whether that be in Toronto, Hong Kong, London, Singapore and Australia, who have those companies that have significant assets and or operations here. It is a limited investment universe within which we operate at the moment. We are today between 75 and 78% exposed to the mining and resource sector. It's something that we would like to diversify away from. And from our perspective, we really think that the opportunity moving forward will be to place more capital in Mongolia through the Mongolian Stock Exchange as we start to see privatizations of state-owned enterprises, as we see more private companies coming to market requiring expansion capital simply due to the phenomenal growth in demand that's likely to expect, that we expect is likely to go across the economy. So that will then give us opportunities to diversify into other sectors and industries across the economy.
One of the things that I'm fascinated by when you say we are not resource-focused group, which makes me think that because the president has been talking about we need to diversify our economy, and also he's talking about the concept of rainbow economy even. And when I think that when mostly people look at Mongolia as a mining country, obviously recent, following the mining boom. But apart from mining, what other opportunities do you see?
I think there's huge opportunities here in the financial services sector, whether that's banking, whether that's insurance. I think there's an opportunity, hopefully, in the coming months, if not years, that there'll be a local investment management and asset management industry. We've obviously seen some changes already with regards to insurance and mandatory insurance in the country. Hopefully, the country will also start to build its own sovereign wealth reserves. These reserves are going to have to be managed at some point in time. Beyond the financial services sector, we see opportunities in telecommunications, obviously infrastructure development, building materials, consumer staples, agriculture specifically as well. I think there's likely to be a number of opportunities. But at the moment, the focus is very much on mining because that's really the impetus that is going to drive a lot of the growth across the rest of the economy. Interestingly, the Australian Minister for Resources announced, I think 2 weeks ago today actually, Martin Ferguson, that the mining boom in Australia is coming to an end. BHP announced the cancellation of the $30 billion expansion of the Olympic Dam project. Today, Fortescue Mining Group came out and cancelled expansion of their iron ore projects in Australia. And I think what that really does is also highlights now the importance of Mongolia in terms of resource supply, specifically to China, and ultimately we see that supply going as well to South Korea and to Japan as well.
It's interesting because when I first heard that the mining boom is over, I thought it was, well, I mean, regardless of what I think, what did you think, for example, because you're a native of Australia, and when he said mining boom is now effectively over?
Well, to be honest, I was a little bit surprised. I don't think the mining boom in Australia is quite over. I think, perhaps there's a sunset now coming onto the horizon. But from my perspective, what that does do is highlight in the mind of many Australians, and particularly Australian investors, the growing importance of a country and economy like Mongolia. It's a drum that I've been beating now in Australia for a very long period of time, that people didn't realize that in 2011, Mongolia became the largest coal exporting country to China. That was a mantle that Australia has held for 11 years since China became an energy importer in 2001. Australian investors at that point in time were shocked to hear that statistic, whereas now I think people are beginning to wake up and realize the growing importance of this previously not particularly well-known nation.
But when you look at Australia, do you see now you are working here in Mongolia, but do you see Australia 20, 30 years ago when you're here in Mongolia? Or is it difficult to say?
I think that's quite difficult to say. I mean, they're two very, very different countries with two very, very different histories. I mean, Australia was only really colonized by settlers just over 2 centuries ago. Mongolia obviously has a very rich and a very long history. It's clearly a very, very exciting time for Mongolia now. After almost 700 years of oppression and occupation, once again now the country is really on the precipice, I think, perhaps over the course of this term of government, to really achieve financial independence, which I think is something that the country hasn't really experienced since the last of the great Khans.
Mm-hmm. Probably. And if you look at Mongolia, it's obviously, people have different perspectives, but what's your, for example, philosophies and styles in the frontier markets like Mongolia?
In terms of investing?
In terms of investment, yeah.
I don't think it's possible to invest in any emerging market or frontier market without working with an experienced, knowledgeable and trustworthy local partner. There are local issues that everybody has to deal with, you have to be aware of, and specifically I think you really need to have access to local information on the ground. And that's why initially when we conceived setting up the Car Mongolia Equity Fund, our first priority was to identify a local partner to work with. We now have a very strong working joint venture with a local investment bank. And beyond that, we have one of our own directors on the ground who lives here in Ulaanbaatar full-time. And for us, that was the first very important step. In terms of the companies within which we invest, we're bottom-up stock pickers. It's on-the-ground research, it's meeting with management, it's taking site visits, it's meeting with directors. There's a number of specific things that we look for.
When you look from the outside and both you're putting your boots on the ground, what do you see, what challenges you face, for example?
Well, the first challenge was to identify a group to work with. And we spent a number of months researching a number of different organizations here. There's always challenges to navigate. I mean, particularly at the moment, frustrations that we face on an ongoing basis is often the levels of bureaucracy that we have to navigate really to get anything done. Hopefully this is something that will change and evolve over time, and I think is a hallmark to the last couple of decades of administration.
Because when people come to Mongolia, they say it's sometimes it's like a European country with a lot of Asians. People's mentality is somewhat different. But how do you see? How do you view Mongolians? As it's like sometimes it's like a banana thing, isn't it? you know about the terminology of banana.
I do.
Right. Okay.
I've lived in Singapore for a decade now, and I've spent a lot of time traveling throughout Southeast Asia and North Asia. And it's something I'm familiar with. I have to say my experiences have been outstandingly positive. I see a lot of very young, very well-educated, often foreign-educated Mongolians that are excited about the growing economy, that are excited about all of the opportunities that this country now faces. Most people whom I meet with are multilingual, whether they're speaking English, Russian, Bulgarian, Japanese. I mean, it's very amazing to me the number of Mongolians that have all had very decent foreign education. And I think that's a real driving force now in the country.
You have, we could edit it at a later stage. Anything that is not making you happy or fully satisfied?
No, I might just actually, my hands have been sweating a little bit. I might just wipe the table a bit. So I hope it's going okay from your perspective. You
okay?
Yeah.
You need some tissue, or would you be okay? Can we have some tissue, please? Yeah.
No, I actually think I should be okay, yeah.
You'll be okay.
Yeah.
3, 2, 1. Where do you see high investment in 5 years, for example? What's your medium and long-term strategy?
Well, in 5 years' time, I would like to think that the percentage exposure of our portfolio is much more heavily weighted to investing across the Mongolian Stock Exchange. At the moment, we have just under 30% of our portfolio is locally listed companies, and the rest is international. I would like to see that shift entirely. I would also like to think that perhaps in 5 years' time, we also have a local office specifically dedicated to local investment product, whether that's working with local institutional investors, which I think are likely to emerge in the coming years, or whether it's also working on a retail basis with investors that are looking to work with professional investors for their investment needs.
You said in your conversation that you invest in companies that are listed at Mongolian Stock Exchange.
Yes.
And what are the major complications when you pick those companies? Because you know, when you start, well, investors want transparency. Investors want corporate governance. Do those? I mean, those companies have all this. That is my question.
It has been difficult to identify companies that satisfy those, specifically those two requirements, and there are two main requirements. Beyond that, we also look for experienced management, which has had either international experience as well. Obviously, independent directors is very important for us as well, and it's encouraging to see that that's being mandated at present. Experience of the board is interesting for us. We have an investment in a company here that has a very, very senior international board, and that gives us comfort as well. Access to management, access to directors is key. And you know, transparency, I think the concept of transparency in Mongolia is one that is developing. We would like to see more forward-looking statements from some of the companies within which we've invested, but it's not unexpected.
Some of the companies just not used to releasing those informations.
Some companies are, and I mean a lot of companies here continue to operate as if they're a private company with, you know, a family shareholder, and they don't feel necessarily any requirement to report to shareholders. Typically, we have to avoid investments like that.
And the recent deal with the Mongolian Stock Exchange and the London Stock Exchange could actually change things a little bit.
I think it will. You know, I think there's a growing regulatory regime here. There's going to be you know, a number of changes, particularly with regards to the new issues that are likely to come to market. We're very happy, and we were very excited in 2011 when the agreement was signed between the Mongolian Stock Exchange and the London Stock Exchange. And I think it's hugely positive for the Mongolian capital market.
In terms of, well, we touched the subject of Mongolian Stock Exchange. What do you think of the securities law, the new law that is about to be passed? Well, again, you would complain about the clarity of information.
Well, you know, we'll wait till it's passed. We don't know exactly what the timing of that's going to be. We're awaiting eagerly, as are a number of investors, particularly those that have been waiting for the IPO of Tavan Tolgoi. And this is obviously something that has to be achieved before that IPO. For us, it represents a lot more than that. So we'll wait and see.
Well, I mean, we could postpone the discussion of the law that is about to be postponed, but we should touch the subject of the law that has already been passed, which is the foreign direct investment law. What is your reaction to that law?
I understand the basis of the law and really what you know, the government was trying to achieve, very much in the interests or the national interests of Mongolia and of Mongolians. I think that it perhaps wasn't thought through as well as it could have been. I think it was rushed. I think perhaps there was not as much consultation as there could have been. And as we mentioned, or I mentioned earlier, I think the real issue there is a transfer pricing issue in order to protect the economic interests of Mongolia with regards to taxes of resources that are like, and I mean, I think the focus here is resources. They've named three strategic or important industries, but the focus at the moment, specifically with the timing of the rushing that legislation through Parliament, was clearly with regards to mining interests.
Australia is one of the countries that have similar regulation, isn't it?
Several other resource-rich jurisdictions, Australia and Canada, have somewhat similar legislation in place. I agree that from some perspectives the legislation passed in Mongolia is perhaps not as restrictive. However, it's also not particularly clear. The specific language used in a couple of points across the law remains very, very unclear. The government at that point in time mentioned that it would not be retrospective. Well, that's also not clear. It's also not stated. There's a number of other specific issues with the current legislation as it sits, and we hope that there'll be an opportunity for that to be reconsidered.
But the similar law that passed in Australia did not really hurt the investment environment, did it?
No, but I think the very big difference there is that, you know, Australia was already a very wealthy country. Australia is able to largely fund its own growth and development. What is clear in Mongolia at the moment is a country with huge opportunities and huge ambitions. But at the moment, the public sector and the private sector simply do not have the wealth in order to fund their own growth and development needs. The country is heavily dependent upon foreign investment, and that's something that the country has to acknowledge. I certainly believe that over the course of whether it's this term of government or beyond, the country is on the precipice of financial independence, both in the private sector and in the public sector. But today that's not the case.
Can I just understand that your view is somewhat, you're not really concerned about the law itself, but the uncertainties surrounding the law or the implementations or ways to interpret that law is a bit is the part that you're more concerned about?
Yes, that's right. It's not clear what the review process is going to be. Obviously, it has to be transparent and it has to be very efficient. At the moment, there has been essentially a bottleneck, and because it's unclear, there are a number of transactions waiting to happen which simply aren't happening. I mean, foreign investment into particularly the mining sector at the moment for new exploration or for development has essentially stopped from my perspective. When I talk to people that are looking to take a number of these projects to market, or when I talk to investors that are interested to invest capital here, those transactions have stopped. The capital flows have stopped. And everybody is waiting to see exactly what this process will be.
We could talk a little bit about the government and its relation to investment or the foreign investors. The so-called the reformist government is now in charge as a result of the last general election, obviously. What changes or structural or what changes do you think that they should, what reforms that you think they should take or they should implement?
You know, I'm not in the business of policy reform. I think that, you know, obviously the Democratic Party is recognized, you know, as the business-friendly party. They're operating a coalition government at the moment, but we're also very confident that they have a 75% majority within that coalition. The Democratic Party has been part of a coalition government for the last several terms. They have been involved in setting policy and writing legislation in a consultative basis previously with the Mongolian People's Party. So we're not concerned that there's going to be any major shocks with regards to a policy shift. However, as we've touched on, there's a number of issues that have arisen recently, foreign investment law specifically, that we hope clarity is provided on very quickly.
And when we talk about most of the people who are from outside Mongolia say the resource nationalism is on the rise, and the talks of being, you know, the resource nationalists in the government. And well, I mean, there is a distinction, obviously, between what is popular domestically and what the real government intends to do. And you share the same view?
It's a misconception that we continually have to battle when talking to international investors. Over the last several months, I think there have been some very irresponsible people within media organizations, specifically those internationally, that have misreported and have misrepresented exactly what has been happening in Mongolia and what is happening on the ground. And I think, unfortunately, all that has done is to raise more fear and more concerns and essentially create more misunderstandings of exactly what is happening on the ground.
So there is obviously a different level of interpretation, what's actually happening on the ground and what's being reported overseas.
Very much. There is a huge divergence. In fact, I would go so far as to say some international media organizations have been completely fallacious with regards to some of their reports.
Can you give me a specific example?
I'd rather not.
Why is that?
Well, the media can be very powerful.
Well, let's leave it at that. Well, I mean, you have extensive experience in terms of raising capitals and you know, placing it somewhere that is considered to be right. So I'm going to ask you the following question because some companies, I mean, most companies in Mongolia have difficult time raising capital, both you know, inside Mongolia and outside Mongolia. What do you think the great challenges that they face, and you know, what are the ways and means to overcome those challenges?
Well, I think the main challenge is, from the international investors' perspective, is uncertainty and the perception that there is a lack of stability, specifically then with regards to the political situation at the moment. Now, perceptions differ, whether that's true or whether that's not. But what the government, I think, needs to do sooner rather than later is come out and publicly demonstrate to both Mongolians, but specifically to the international investment community, that there is stability, that, for example, there is not going to necessarily be a change or a renegotiation to the oil tollgate agreement. That's caused more waves of concern within the international investment community.
So you think the categorical that is not needed, absolutely?
Absolutely, I believe that is not needed. That is an investment agreement that was signed by the government on behalf of the country. You cannot continually look behind and try and change decisions that have already been made. Mongolia is a democracy. The elected government of the day signed an agreement. That agreement is in place. You must be forward-looking.
What Mongolian sovereign other corporations can do, for example, to increase their credit rating overseas?
Well, again, I think it comes back to the two issues of governance and transparency. It's a developing market. It's a market that's going through rapid change at the moment. I think that demonstrating that there is a level of transparency, that it's not a closed shop, that's a great step. Involving independent directors, hopefully some international independent directors, people that have had international experience in more developed markets. This is also a great step in the right direction.
Because if you look at the Western way of doing corporate affairs, the corporate culture is somewhat unfamiliar to Mongolian companies, because if you look at, obviously, if you talk about the independent directors, placing someone absolutely got nothing to do with your company and placing him and paying him a salary is just not, Mongolian companies find it, yeah, that's right, foreign concept. But I mean, there is a progress being made, I think.
I think there is as well, but that unfortunately is going to have to go hand in hand in taking somebody else's money whom you don't know and investing it in your own company.
Yeah, that's right. Hang on a second, let me just,
sure.
Because we are about to... Guessing it? Okay, за тэрлүүн дараа нь яагаад явъя заа ёо. Одоо болохоор наалдаж өгөхгүй яагаад тах юм. Okay? The advising and on the timing. So let me just...
Sure.
Yeah.
I hope I've managed to sufficiently answer.
No, absolutely, absolutely. I really do enjoy. Okay. Okay. Well, I mean, now you were. Have this excessive portfolio of large investment, and what brings you to this point, basically? How did you all start?
To be honest, I had what I believe was a very, very good fortune to meet Robert Friedland in 2006 at a cocktail party in Beijing. At that point in time, I had absolutely no idea who Robert Friedland was. I wasn't aware of Ivanhoe Mines. But I met a character who was very engaging and spoke very passionately about the opportunities of a massive land mass next to China, huge resource endowment, small population with very little infrastructure. He essentially described it to me as an investor's dream. There was so many opportunities there. And that stuck in my mind. I went back to Singapore, where I've been living now for 10 years, and I tried to find out a lot more about Mongolia because I wasn't very familiar with the country or its history beyond, obviously, the legends of Genghis Khan. And I found at that point in time there was not really any conduit in order to access this growing market with huge opportunities at that point, other than investing directly into Ivanhoe shares. Emerging markets and frontier markets have always been a personal passion of mine. They've always intrigued me, and I always think that that's really where you can find some amazing opportunities. The more I investigated, the more I found that there was no collective investment vehicle or fund or any easy way for a foreign investor to gain access to this market. When I first traveled here in 2010, I opened my first brokerage account. At that point in time, it was a rather challenging experience and a fairly onerous task, going through the process of opening an account with a central depository and clearinghouse and establishing brokerage relationships. I asked a number of the brokers and the bankers with whom I met with, why is it so challenging for foreign money to come to your local market? Why don't you have a fund? Why isn't there a collective investment vehicle that was open-ended, that provided some level of liquidity? And they all laughed at me and they said, everybody asks us that. And I realized that, unfortunately, at that point in time, these individuals didn't have the experience or the expertise in order to structure something that takes the best of offshore jurisdictions and structures and invests then into local opportunities. So upon confirming then in 2010 that such a vehicle didn't exist, I thought there was a huge opportunity here to take something to the market and participate in the growth of this country.
Was it summertime or wintertime when you first came to Mongolia?
It was wintertime.
It was wintertime.
And it was quite a shock coming
Yeah, that
from
proved
Singapore.
me wrong, because I have a theory, for example, those who come to Mongolia during wintertime never come back, especially in January. Nevertheless, how do you see Myanmar and North Korea? Exactly what you saw in Mongolia 10 years ago, for example.
I think it's a little bit different. It's a different story. I think these are two very interesting countries. They obviously also have had a number of challenges in their past. I think unquestionably, as these markets start to open up, and I am a firm believer that as Myanmar starts to open up, I also expect that in some point in time the same will occur in North Korea. There will be opportunities for foreign investors to place capital, to participate in the growth and the development of those countries. But personally, my view is that that's 5-6 years away. I think it's still very, very early days. There's a number of challenges that those economies are going to face as they move towards a free and open market. But it's interesting to keep an eye on them. But my focus today is very firmly here in Mongolia, and I think this is really where I see the opportunities over the course of the next decade.
Well, we talk a lot about mining boom and resource curse, and some are optimistic, some are pessimistic. Which one are you about the development of Mongolia?
I'm optimistic. I'm always optimistic. But the government has a challenge ahead of itself, and it is really going to be up to the government in order to try and manage that. It's going to be a huge task. I mean, the country is already experiencing double-digit inflation. I think it hit 15% last quarter. It's not easy, but I think it's not going to be bad.
Well, I'm sure that a lot of people share that view, being optimistic. And thank you very much for coming and talking to us.
Thank you very much for having me.